Warfare Mastery Institute, and welcome to this lesson on integrated air defense systems. This lesson uses the OBL, or outcomes-based learning approach, which means that it's not going to be a traditional video where I'm just going to be talking or reading a script. I'm going to be asking you questions as we move along to get you to think. If you're in a classroom environment, you can pause and discuss at the various points where I ask questions. If you're by yourself, it can be helpful to write down a few notes whenever I present questions or decisions. And the reason for learning in this way is, first of all, you learn better, you learn more effectively, but it also teaches you how to think and how to be a better tactical, operational, or strategic decision maker. Any military history case study can either be used just to teach you about the events that took place in history, or you can use it to actually make yourself better at your job, to improve your ability to make decisions by putting yourself in the shoes of the leaders at the time with the information they had available to them at the time, and to think about what you would have done in their position. So that's the aim here. One of the best things about this process is that it's universally relevant. You may not be an air defense officer or a fighter pilot. You may never have the need to build or execute an integrated air defense. That doesn't matter, because working through this problem in your brain, it's like exercising muscles. It's building skills and abilities in your brain that will be relevant to solving any problems, whatever your profession, whatever types of situations you're faced with. So when talking about integrated air defense, it's useful to use a case study. One of the best ones is the Battle of Britain in 1940, and it's useful to put yourself in the shoes of a British military officer named Hugh Dowding. Hugh Dowding was in charge of Fighter Command, and he was responsible for developing an integrated air defense system to protect Britain against Germany. All right, so you're Hugh Dowding, and you are expecting that the Germans are going to launch bombers escorted by fighters to attack targets in your territory. Now, it's reasonable to believe that some of the first targets they're going to attack are your airfields, because if they can destroy all of your aircraft on the ground, then you'll have a much more difficult time resisting their continued bombing campaign, and they can have air superiority and bomb pretty much whatever they want. All right, so first, let's imagine you don't do anything. You just have your aircraft parked on the ground on the airfield, and one day you look up and there are the German bombers flying over, dropping bombs down on you. So the first question is, what could you have done to not be in this position? In answering the last question of what to do about the bombers over your airfield, one of the most common answers you might have come up with is launch fighter aircraft to shoot down the bombers. So let's think through that. You see the bombers coming towards the airfield, the alert siren goes off, and you say, okay, let's launch fighters up there to shoot down the bombers. Now, think through what might be some of the problems with that course of action. To understand why launching fighters isn't necessarily as straightforward a solution as you might imagine, we need to look at some technical data. So the first data point we need to look at is, how high are the enemy bombers flying? We can say that maybe they were flying around 25,000 feet. Okay, the next piece of data is, what is the climb rate of the aircraft we're operating with? Now, whenever you're looking at data, it always changes based on a whole number of factors, but we'll just use some kind of general planning numbers in here. So for the Spitfire, we'll say that you can climb at 2,500 feet per minute. So that means 2,500 feet per minute to get to 25,000 feet will take you 10 minutes. So if it takes you 10 minutes to get to the altitude of the bombers to shoot them down, what does that mean about when you have to spot the bombers? When you spot the bombers coming towards your airfield, are they 10 minutes out? Well, most likely they're pretty close. Once you spot them, it's probably too late to get your aircraft into the air and up to that altitude in time to intercept the bombers. And that's if the pilots are already sitting in the aircraft with the engines running. What if the pilots are sleeping? What if they're eating lunch? Whatever it might be, it's going to take you time. It's going to take you at least 10 minutes, most likely more, to get the aircraft into position where they can actually shoot down the bombers. So, that being said, what are some potential solutions to get around this problem? In looking at how to solve the problem we just discussed about it taking time for your fighters to get to the altitude where they can actually intercept the bombers, there are a number of different solutions you might have come up with. One might be using a combat air patrol. So instead of having the fighters climb 25,000 feet from the ground, why not just have the fighters already flying at 25,000 feet over the airfield? So this is an option, but think about that for a minute and think about what might be some of the disadvantages of having aircraft circling over your airfield at 25,000 feet waiting for the bombers to come in. So what are the problems with just having your aircraft already flying at 25,000 feet over the airfield when the bombers come in? The main problems relate to efficiency. So think about it. Your aircraft have limited fuel, and you may have limited fuel as a country. Fuel is a precious resource. If you're having your aircraft constantly in the air, you're burning a lot of fuel that you don't need to be burning. It also requires time to refuel the aircraft. They can't stay up there forever. So maybe you're patrolling up there for hours and you need to come down for fuel. And at the moment you decide to come down for fuel, that's when the enemy aircraft actually show up. Another factor to consider is maintenance. The longer your aircraft are flying in the air each day, the more maintenance they're going to require on the ground. So if your aircraft are constantly flying around on combat air patrols, the demand on your maintenance capabilities, maintenance crews, logistics is going to be much higher and less efficient. Final point to consider is pilot fatigue. Pilots need to sleep, they need to eat. They can't be flying all of the time. They're going to need to rotate down to rest periodically. So if there's a very, very demanding patrol schedule, pilots aren't going to be as rested and aren't going to be as alert when the enemy actually does show up. So thinking through the combat air patrol option and some of the problems with it starts to get us closer to the real solution we're looking for. So at this point, take a moment and think about what is it that we're really trying to accomplish here? What's the most effective way to actually defeat these bombers that are coming in and trying to bomb our airfields? So at this point, it's probably pretty obvious that what we're trying to achieve here is early warning. We want to know that the bombers are coming earlier, where they're coming from, so we can get the fighters up to altitude in time and to intercept them ideally before they're able to drop their bombs on their target. So how do we do that? We've already determined that having lookouts at the base won't give us enough early warning. So looking at the hypothetical map below, think about what might you do in order to buy yourself more time to intercept the bombers earlier. So looking at the map below, one of the most obvious solutions is to place sensors further away from the airfield, the enemy target itself, closer to the coast to spot the bombers earlier on. Now, people who've studied the Battle of Britain immediately start thinking about radar, and radar was an extremely decisive factor in that battle and is a very important part of integrated air defense. However, radar is not a prerequisite. One interesting note is that Claire Chennault in China, with the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, developed a similar integrated air defense system, but he had much fewer radar capabilities and much less effective radar capabilities than the British did. He primarily used a network of observers and spotters. So just keep in mind that while radar is very important, you don't necessarily need radar. There could be other sensors involved in integrated air defense. So looking at the map below, let's imagine that we've set up a whole bunch of observer stations along the coast, and then we have our airfields with fighters further in. And we tell the observer stations, okay, when you see aircraft coming in, call the fighter stations and warn them ahead of time so they can launch the fighters to intercept the bombers. So what are some of the problems with that approach? There are a number of problems with having the observer stations call the fighter bases directly. The first one being, who do they call? If there are a number of different fighter bases, not all of those fighter bases might be in a position to launch aircraft to intercept the threat. Some of them might be refueling their aircraft. Some might have not enough aircraft because of maintenance issues. The observers have no way of knowing this. So it makes sense for the observers not to call the bases directly, but instead to call some central location that collects all of the data from the different observers, and then that central location calls the fighter bases and gives them their orders to push aircraft out to intercept. This also obviously makes it a lot easier to prioritize. So if you're an observer and you spot 20 bombers coming in from the east, and then another observer spots 30 bombers coming in from the west, the central location can look at both of those threats, figure out, okay, what aircraft do we have at our disposal, and allocate aircraft to intercept either both of the threats or to pick the threat that's more immediate or more serious and focus on that one. So for all those reasons, it's critical to have a central location to collect all of the various data coming in from the different sensors, whether it's observer stations or radar posts. So given that we have this central location and we have all of these different observer stations or radar posts or sensors that are feeding information to that central hub, what are some of the types of problems that could emerge in that system? The fighter bases need to report accurate information as well, and there needs to be a system for that. As we discussed, a given fighter base might not be able to intercept because they're in the process of refueling their aircraft. Well, the central location needs to know that, but they can't know that if the fighter base doesn't let the central location know, okay, we're refueling our aircraft from this time to this time, or this is the number of aircraft we have available. All of that information needs to be transmitted in an efficient manner to the central location, or else they're not going to be able to make accurate decisions. And when you think through exactly what that entails, there's a lot of work that goes into that, to establishing a detailed system. And it's not just a matter of establishing the system. Once again, anyone who's had military experience knows you can't just say, okay, here are the reporting requirements for the observers and here are the reporting requirements for the air bases. Okay, got it? It's not going to work. You need to continually test it and figure out, well, people are more effective at reporting this, but they're failing here. And it needs to be a constant effort to enhance those systems and make sure that they work smoothly and effectively. So those familiar with the Battle of Britain case study know that everything we've discussed so far is pretty much exactly what Hugh Dowding and Fighter Command did in order to be so effective against the Germans. And that central location that we've been talking about was called Bentley Priory. That was where all of the information from the various radar stations and observers came in, and Bentley Priory figured out, okay, we have this number of aircraft at our disposal. How do we employ those aircraft in the most effective way possible to deal with the threat? Now, in reality, there were multiple centers like Bentley Priory at various levels of command, but for the purposes of this vignette, we'll simplify it by just focusing on Bentley Priory. There are more lessons we can learn from this case study about how to be effective in doing all of this. So one question that we can ask is, obviously everyone needs to sleep. So let's say you're coming on shift. You've been sleeping for the past 8 hours. You have no idea what's been going on for the past 8 hours, and you show up, and it's the responsibility of the current officer in charge to tell you everything that's going on to get you up to speed. And once again, as we discussed, there's a lot of information. There are a lot of observer stations. There could be multiple strikes currently being detected. How is that officer going to transmit that information to you? And what kind of problems could arise when you're going through that process? Thinking about the last question, it's probably obvious that the most efficient way to record and process information is not for the outgoing officer to explain verbally everything that's happening and everything that's been going on to the incoming officer. There needs to be a more efficient way to capture and transmit information. And the best way to do this is with something called a Common Operating Picture, or COP. Common operating pictures are used in all different types of military operations, and there are many different ways to do it. That's exactly what they used at Bentley Priory. It usually involves a map, and the British came up with many creative ways to make that map just intuitively understandable. The new commander could walk in, look at the map, and immediately develop an understanding of the current situation. One technique they used was to track the movement of contacts on the map using arrows, but those arrows were color-coded to match a color-coded clock. So commanders could immediately look at the color of the arrows and determine whether those contacts were fresh or when that information had been reported. Now, note that in the example on the left, the map, graphics, and timescale have been simplified in a number of ways to make this concept easier to explain. But we'll go into detail about the way that the real map actually worked in a later lesson. Up to this point, we've also only talked about fighter intercept. You also have at your disposal AAA, anti-aircraft artillery, flak, ways to shoot down enemy aircraft from the ground. Now, given what we've just discussed about the common operating picture, how might the common operating picture be useful when figuring out how to most effectively employ your flak assets? The nature of flak as a weapon system is different from fighters. You're not going to send flak on the road to intercept bombers when you detect them. You have to pre-position it. It's a stationary asset. So what that means is you have to figure out where you want to place it so it's most effective. If you put all your flak defending a location that the enemy never tries to hit, you're not taking maximum advantage of the weapon system. So how do you figure out where's the most effective place to position your flak? Going back to the common operating picture, this brings up another critical element that the common operating picture needs to include, and that's identifying historical patterns. It's not enough just to have the current common operating picture. You need to record that common operating picture and identify, okay, this is what the enemy did yesterday, this is what the enemy did 2 days ago, this is what the enemy did last week. And when you start to put all that information together, you start to identify patterns. Those patterns will allow you to better decide where to position stationary assets like flak or AAA. So given everything we've discussed so far, at this point it can be useful to think about how does this all come together? What's the narrative from start to finish of how this system works and how do we use it to be effective in defeating the enemy? So just in general terms, first we put out our sensors, our early warning, whether that's observers, radar, or both. Then we have a central location like Bentley Priory that compiles all the information from those sensors. Now we need to give those sensors specific information requirements and tell them exactly the information that we need and how to report it, and we need to enforce those requirements. Then we also need to give reporting requirements to the fighter bases, asking them for information like how many aircraft are operational at any given time, when are they refueling the aircraft, etc. And we need to give them those requirements in a way that's not overly taxing. We don't want them to have to report every 10 minutes because we want them to be able to exercise initiative and focus on winning the fight, not focus on constantly reporting back to higher. So we need to figure out a simple and reasonable way for them to report back the information that we need without taxing them unnecessarily. As we discussed, we also need to develop systems at Bentley Priory for compiling information in a way that's very easily understandable, and we need to figure out a way to record that information in order to identify patterns over time. So once we've done all that and our system is in place, then we sit back and hopefully it works. So we spot enemy bombers coming in from one direction and another flight of enemy bombers coming in from another direction. At this point, the smart folks at Bentley Priory need to look at that common operating picture and know, okay, we have aircraft that are currently in the air at this location. We have this airbase that has 10 aircraft ready. We have this airbase that has 20 aircraft ready, but it's further away. And they need to make a decision on which aircraft do we send to intercept those bombers and where do we intercept them. They have to do a whole bunch of math and say, okay, the bombers are traveling at this course, at this speed. We need to send the fighters to this location. So they call up the fighters and they give them orders. They give them a vector and say, all right, here's your heading, here's the distance, and you're going to intercept the bombers in 20 minutes, whatever it might be. The fighters follow those instructions, and hopefully they arrive at the right place in time to be able to intercept the bombers. Now, for the purposes of this short course, this is a very simplified, generalized explanation of this, and we'll go into more detail on this type of operation and all types of operations in future courses. But the key thing to recognize is that this is a constant and ongoing process. This isn't something that you do just once, you shoot down the bombers and you win. There's a constant interplay between intelligence and decision making. And ultimately, this process, this case study, is really about decision making. And in order to make effective decisions, you need good intelligence and timely intelligence that's up to date. And getting that intelligence isn't easy. You need to be constantly looking for it. You need to set yourself up with sensors to detect the enemy. And then you need to have systems to be able to transmit that information about the enemy to the right place, compile it, make it easily understandable so that you can look at it, look at that information, and make decisions. And once you make those decisions, the situation changes. And you need to be aware of how the situation changes. And all of those sensors, all of those intelligence collection assets that you have out there need to be able to update you on how your decisions are changing the battlefield picture, because you need to then make another decision. And your ability to continually make good decisions and employ your forces in an effective way are ultimately what's going to allow you to win the fight. So once again, this case study was about integrated air defense systems, which is a relevant thing to understand for any student of warfare or any military leader. But it's also about decision making in general, about intelligence collection, about having systems for using intelligence to drive decisions. So a useful thing to think about at this point is, how does this case study apply to your specific mission requirements? If you're an Air Force officer or if you're an air defense officer, it's pretty obvious how these lessons can apply to your profession. In truth, you probably know most of this already. As an infantry officer or NCO setting up a deliberate defense, how do we set up observation posts to detect the enemy, to give us early warning, to respond accordingly in our defensive position or deploy our reserve? The same principles can apply to law enforcement. When you think about it, a 911 call is very similar to a radar station or an observer post calling up Bentley Priory and reporting enemy aircraft inbound. Once you get the 911 call, what officers do you have that can respond? Who do you send? How long is it going to take them to get there? So all these same lessons, all these same concepts apply to a number of different situations. And we hope this case study was useful for you in developing yourself into a better military or security professional.